So we're going to talk about the Reconstruction era now, which lasted from about 1865, the end of the Civil War, until about 1877. Though in some ways, I suppose it's still going on. It's one of the most frustrating periods in American history, with huge opportunities lost. Quite a mess. So the goals of Reconstruction were, first just to get down there and help people who were in need of help. Remember, the South was pretty devastated. It's where almost all the battles were fought, and those got more and more nasty as the war went on. So there's a lot of hungry people down there who needed immediate help, both white and black people. The next goal, which is obviously a huge goal, was getting the southern states back into the Union, and to do so relatively happily. That's obviously a huge project. And then they had to rebuild all the institutions that were gone. I mean, there was in many places like all the young men were gone, and so there's not necessarily a police force down there. There's not civic institutions that are functioning. The economy is a complete shambles, and all that's going to have to get fixed and rebuilt. And then finally, you're gonna have to make sure that the gains, if in the Civil War, about freeing the slaves, don't get lost just by having things return to business as usual. So it was vitally important that they figure out a way to safeguard the newfound rights of the freedmen. So there are two distinct periods of Reconstruction. The first is called the Presidential Reconstruction, which only lasted for a couple years because the president, Andrew Johnson, had a relatively minimal sense of the federal government's role in the process. And then the second part of it is called Congressional Reconstruction or Military Reconstruction, when Congress pretty much takes over the process, and it lasts for about 10 years, and they send troops down there to guarantee that things go well. So a big part of the problem was that Abraham Lincoln died. This is a photo of his funeral. And he had given great thought to how to proceed with Reconstruction. He had tremendous backing at that point because he had seen the Union through the war, and he was eager to get on with that very, very difficult business. He's quite a nuanced thinker and a massively empathetic man, as we've already discussed. And his successor, Andrew Johnson, was not nearly as up to the task. So Lincoln's idea of Reconstruction was largely based on clemency. He's got some options there, right? Do you get real harsh and say you guys are a bunch of traitors and execute all of the politicians who broke away and the generals who broke their oath to the Union, and get real harsh and try to force the southern states to pay for the war with reparations? That would be one extreme. Lincoln was sort of favored the other extreme, which is this was a family fight, and these things happen, and as long as the beginnings of a critical mass of Southerners are ready to play ball and come back to the Union, then they're welcome back with open arms, and we're going to do what we can to help this process. Not only is the South not going to have to pay for the war beyond what they've already paid, the North is going to send people and resources and expertise down to the South to help rebuild it. A famous phrase from Lincoln was, with malice toward none, with charity for all. That sums up well what his attitude was going to be. So the news wasn't all bad. There was this spirit of clemency. There was quite an outpouring of support from people in the North, and especially churches. And so a lot of volunteers went down south to help, to bring, again, food and clothes and blankets, to help, rebuild farms and build courthouses, and especially to build schools and to staff those schools. And so there was a lot of people realized this is a terrible situation and we all need to pitch in. And so many thousands of people went from the north to the south to try to help out. But there are a lot more challenges than there were blessings when it came to Reconstruction. The first big problem was that even though the war was won, there's still just virulent racism in the South. Potentially the war made that even worse because, now a lot of white Southerners are humiliated and they're looking for scapegoats, and they don't point the finger at themselves. They're going to point their finger somewhere else. There had been crop failures. The wheat crop had largely failed in 1865 and in 1866. So there was just not a lot of food to be had. A lot of the farms had not been planted because the menfolk were off to war. There's nobody to get seeds. And a lot of the men died. And so, the farms just aren't very productive. A lot of the livestock was eaten by troops, either from the north or south. There was a bad recession in the north, as often happens after a war, when industry, goes back down to normal levels. And then a lot of the local leaders in the South were the same people that had been leaders before the war. So you have a lot of pretty, dyed-in-the-wool Confederates who are now, again, congressmen or governors or mayors. And so these are the same people who didn't like the situation before the war. Now it's even worse as far as they're concerned. And then there was a lot of corruption. A lot of good people headed south, but a lot of people trying to work for their own account headed south during Reconstruction, and they're called carpetbaggers. They're people who are, doing their best to make a buck off of other people's misfortune, and that was a real problem. And again, just in general, the South was in a devastated, dysfunctional condition. So there's this huge problem that the people with the land are the white people, and they are angry, and they are poor, and they don't know what to do because they don't have enough money to get back to where they were to run their farms properly. And now they don't have their sort of slave labor force anymore either. So on the other hand, you've got 4 million plus freedmen who don't have any land, and that's going to be, the huge problem. And how are we going to deal with that problem? So the condition of the black freedmen is paradoxical, because on the one hand, they're ecstatic that they've been granted freedom. On the other hand, they don't have any land, most of them. They have almost no money. They have almost no education. And most of their skills are farm skills, so they don't really have many skills in industry. So what are they going to do? And this question, which we'll call the land question, becomes a really central question in the early dawn of Reconstruction. What are you going to do to empower the freedmen? Are you going to give them land? Are you going to redistribute land from the plantation owners who abused the freedmen for centuries, and to sort of give the freedmen 40 acres and a mule so that they can be self-sustaining, or are you not? So there are sort of three options here at the beginning of Reconstruction. You can give land, redistribute land to the freedmen, which would, again, maximize their self-sufficiency, which would probably safeguard them more than virtually any other thing you could do, so that they could provide for themselves and be free, relatively free of racial antagonism and harm. Option number two would be to send in federal troops. Don't give them land, but send in troops to make sure that the white aristocrats play nice and get with the program. And then option three would be actually no. You have to let the states decide for themselves, and who knows what they'll do. But you trust them to do what's right for them, and you leave it up to them. So what happened? Well, to make a long story short, they decided against redistributing land or giving away government land to the freedmen. For better or worse, probably for the worse. Andrew Johnson, as we will see, the president, was for option number three, leave it up to the states. The Congress, what are called the radical Republicans, who had a sort of majority in Congress at the time, disagreed with that and had suspicions that would be a nightmare for the freedmen, and they sent in troops in 1867 and to enforce the rules and the laws and the rights of the freedmen. In 1877, as we will see, that came to an end, and it flipped over to option three, which was the sort of voluntary good behavior of the former aristocratic people who had run things beforehand, and as we'll see, that didn't work out. So, as we said, the Andrew Johnson succeeds Abraham Lincoln as president, and it's a big step down. It's like going from Peyton Manning to, some middle school quarterback. So who is this guy? On paper, he looks like a good running mate for Lincoln and a good successor for Lincoln. He's sort of a moderate Southerner. Who was from Tennessee, but was pro-union. So he was a slave-holding pro-union guy. And so if you try to get your head around that, well, he might have the combination of insights that could pull this off, but it turns out no. He's not very well educated. He's very smart, but again, not very educated, which is often a very dangerous combination. And again, just the fact that he was owning slaves right up into the 1860s is not a good sign for how this is going to go. So again, on the virtue side, he's smart. And he's courageous. He showed a lot of courage during the Civil War, and it was tough to be in Tennessee and be pro-union. So, again, it seems like this is a good sign. He has the courage to stand up for what he thinks is right, which is usually a good thing. Of course, it assumes that what you think is right, and that appears not to have been the case with our good friend Andrew Johnson. So he's got a lot more problems than virtues. As we said, he was not very well educated. He's apparently unbelievably stubborn, would not listen to other people, wouldn't listen to other people's ideas. He had a pretty big drinking problem. He was definitely not alone for an American man at that era, but not exactly what you're looking for in a president. Sort of made decisions and then didn't necessarily follow through to make sure things turned out right. And then again, this problem of he's a slaveholder into the 1860s. What does that mean? He's probably got some pretty major empathy deficit issues that are going to cause trouble as he tries to navigate the best solution for all of these freedmen for whom apparently he does not have great respect. He did not believe in inequality, and obviously that's a huge problem for an American president. And he was a states' rights guy. He thought this is up to the states to do what they think is the right thing to do for them, and it's not a federal issue. Not everything was bad, though. There were some early successes and important ones. And the Congress, even before the war was over, had set up what was called the Freedmen's Bureau to get ready for Reconstruction. And the Freedmen's Bureau, as the name implies, was set up to facilitate the entry into the mainstream of the former slaves, the freedmen. And in particular, that meant setting up schools and educating them and trying to also make sure that they weren't abused and we didn't just sink back into de facto slavery again. And then also just some early successes with black leaders who made it into Congress and the Senate in those early years after the Civil War. And that's a huge problem for white Southerners because their whole theory is that this would be impossible, right? If black people can be excellent leaders and be excellent men, their whole theory of reality is sort of down the tubes. So this was great news in the early going. So as we said earlier, the Freedmen's Bureau was a success, and one of their big foci was to make sure that the freedmen and their children had opportunity to become educated. And so building schools and staffing schools was one of their top priorities. And the response to this was overwhelmingly positive among the freedmen. It's been desperate for education and viewed it as a huge privilege and way to make their way forward in the world. And they had been denied education for centuries by the white rulers of the southern states. And there was just a massive positive outpouring of thrill at the prospect of getting educated. So often, apparently, the adults would go with their kids to learn how to read and write because they hadn't learned themselves and they really wanted to. So we discussed a second ago how there were some very successful, powerful black leaders in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War and the first wave of elections that black people were allowed to participate in. And we don't have time to talk about the great number of them. One of them in particular was Blanche Bruce, and he's a former slave from Mississippi who was the first black person to serve a full term in the Senate. Bruce was, by all accounts, quite the great guy. He was way ahead of his time in fighting not just for equal rights for blacks, but for Asians and Native Americans as well. He's a very successful businessman, sort of a juggernaut of empathy and compassion, and really working for everybody's good at a time when, again, so many people were trying to milk the system for their own account. And again, it's the existence of people like him is a terrible problem for for racists in the South because he's not supposed to be able to exist. And so his very presence in the Senate and his success as a senator and as a man was quite an insult to white Southerners. So you might be thinking, well, things couldn't have been that bad for blacks after the Civil War because, look, I mean, these guys are getting elected as mayors and senators and congressmen, and so can't be that bad. Obviously, they must have been able to vote. And again, I never understood this when I was a student, so it's important that we realize what's going on here. You know, we've got that general expression in our language, you know, things are going to get worse before they get better. Well, in terms of Reconstruction and race relations in the South, things got better before they got worse. So, you know, these elections are happening and these black men are being elected to office in, you know, the 10 years after the Civil War. That's when they're winning election, when the troops are down there enforcing the right to vote for the freedmen. And that's not going to last. So it's going to take 100 years to get back to the point that blacks had in the United States in the South in 1875 in many ways, at least as far as the ability to be elected to significant office in the South. So there were some early successes. There were also many early failures in Reconstruction. Probably the worst one was the putting in place of what are called black codes, which differed from region to region and village to village. But in general, they're ways to try to return to pre-war status for black people. There's no black public schools. There are terrible race riots break out where white people beat and shoot and stab black people en masse without many repercussions. The beginnings of the nightmare of lynching happen in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. The Ku Klux Klan is founded in an effort to terrorize black people and keep the status quo from prior to the war. And then you just have a lot of the same racist white guys who were in office before the Civil War are again in office after the Civil War. And that's obviously a huge problem because all they learned, most of those guys from the Civil War, was that they lost. They didn't magically become enlightened about race relations. And here's just a sampling of some of the black code rules. Again, there are many of them and were different in different places, but you know, they got as bad as, you know, you can't leave your plantation, or if you're caught without, you know, an ID, or if you're, you know, viewed by a police officer as idling, you know, you could be fined $50, or, you know, and which of those guys is going to have $50? So it becomes the beginnings of the mass imprisonment of black men in the United States, an issue that plagues us to this day. So it's important that we think this through, because so you've got, you know, these Southerners saying, you know what, we're our own culture. Again, they're saying the same stuff they said before the Civil War. We have a state. We get to do what we want in our state, and you know, we want it this way, and we want these rules and these laws, and you can call them black codes or whatever, but these are laws that we're deciding to have, and that's the way that goes. And we need to think through the logic here. So what's the problem in the South after the Civil War? What's the main problem going forward? It's the oppression of black people and the attempt to keep them in the condition they were in before the Civil War started. What's the cause of that problem? Well, it's violent and virulent racism. And so the rationalization is states' rights. We have a right as a state to do what we want. That's the rationalization, and this is what we want, therefore, right? But again, there's this truth, right, that the country's founded on, that all men are created equal. And so the solution to this issue is to protect human rights. That's the solution. And so this is the big issue with Andrew Johnson that gets him in tons of trouble and really is the backdrop of him almost, getting thrown out of office. The radical Republicans and even the moderate Republicans realize that all men are created equal. That is a federal guaranteed right. It's a cornerstone of the United States. So, this question of can a state decide on its own not to treat men equally in the United States? And the answer to that is no. And that's the reason that they overrode all of Andrew Johnson's vetoes and they sent the troops down there, right, to the South. The troops will enforce the federal law at the local level. That's what's going on. And that's what's had to happen, as we will see. So in many ways, we've got the same problem that we had before the Civil War started. You have white Southerners who are claiming that states have the rights to do what they want, and the vast majority of the rest of the population in the United States thinks, actually, no, that's not true. So let's brush off our old knowledge of the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence and get back to that claim, that there's inalienable rights that men have. And so the question then is, what does inalienable mean? And that means that they can't be taken away. They are inherent in being a man, that you have these rights, so that no state can take them away. So it's going to help us to think about, as we think about what inalienable means, it's like, what is the purpose of rights in the first place? The purpose of rights is to protect the individual from the tyranny of the majority. So America has majority rule, but remember the Bill of Rights was put there in the Constitution. They realized, the majority at the federal level might pass laws that are really abusive to individuals. And so we had the Bill of Rights at the federal level. Well, now the states are claiming the right to have their own say. And so, again, the idea of inalienable rights means that the rights don't come from the state in the first place. So a state can't take them away. These are rights that men have as men. So these rights can't be taken away by a state. So in order to keep the states' rights folks at bay, the federal government passes a flurry of incredible legislation, including the 13th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the 14th Amendment, the Reconstruction Acts of 1867-68, and the 15th Amendment. So let's just think through the logic of justice here. You've got the founding fathers make their claims about inalienable rights, and they come up with the Constitution. But the Constitution's not enough, so you need specific legislation because you can't trust people just to live by the Constitution. So you need specific legislation. So you have that. But then you also ultimately, as we're going to see, you need local enforcement of the law. And that's why the troops were sent down there in order to make people follow the laws that were put there to follow the Constitution. At every step of the way, people need to take action in founding things, in legislating, and then in putting that legislation into action. Note to self, or to put it in terms of what we're trying to teach you about character and leadership, everything needs to work, the head, heart, hands in coordination. So you need to figure out what the just laws are. You need to train people in responsive habits of feeling so that they want to follow the law in general. And then you need to have skilled application of like how to make this work. And these three things were not in concert with the federal government and local governments in the South after the Civil War, unfortunately. So what's the argumentative justification for all of this legislation that we're about to talk about? It all goes back to the founding. It all goes back to that initial case for freedom. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what it is. Those are the rights. The states can't take away those rights. And if local governments think they don't have to follow through with this, then we need to specify the legislation, and we need troops down there, boots on the ground, to make sure this happens. So the 13th Amendment, 1865, outlaws slavery in all the states and territories. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was designed to head off the black codes at the pass. And it was really vague, easy to get around, so more legislation was necessary. But just to show you how out of step Andrew Johnson, the President of the United States, was with Lincoln, he actually vetoed that bill, and it was passed over his veto. The Reconstruction Acts were designed to enforce the Civil Rights Act, pretty much. And so they sent the troops down there and divided the whole South up into these military districts to make sure that the black codes were minimized and that the freedmen were actually free. Again, Johnson vetoed this legislation, and it was passed over his veto. The 14th Amendment is the one that just says explicitly, look, this states' rights stuff can't trump the federal guarantees of individual rights. So it's 1868. It just flat out says the states' right thing is done on this. And the 15th Amendment makes voting one of the inalienable rights and sets that clear. And again, states can't undo that. It's a federal issue. So Ulysses Grant comes into the presidency, and he's a great general in the Civil War. What a big hero. Turns out he's just a terrible president. He's just really ineffective as a politician, no matter how good a general he was. And he has this extraordinarily corrupt administration. Everybody is just grabbing what they can get, and he doesn't really do anything about it. The economy's tanking in the North, and he's ultimately indifferent to the plight of the freedmen, and so he's not much better, if at all better, than Andrew Johnson. And it's just downhill from there. He's followed by Rutherford B. Hayes, who says if he's elected president, he will pull the troops out of the South. And the economy had gotten even worse in the North. A lot of people started complaining that all these freedmen are taking people's jobs, and people just wanted to be done with it. All that goodwill that was there in 1865, it just gradually wears out, and people just become selfish, as they often do during bad economic times. And Rutherford B. Hayes follows through with his promise, and he pulls the troops out of the South. When the troops leave the South, it's a catastrophe for the freedmen. Year by year, all the old attitudes towards blacks come back. The black codes come back as Jim Crow laws, and the Reconstruction experiment ends in catastrophe when black people are barely better off than they were under slavery in many cases. Without the troops there, the blacks are not allowed to vote through intimidation and poll taxes and all sorts of shenanigans. So once they can't vote, they're really powerless. They don't have land. Now they don't have the vote. They have no way of affecting the political situation, and it's just a downward disastrous spiral from there. And the same people with the same attitudes that were running things in 1859 start running things again, and it's a disaster. Here's some examples of Jim Crow laws. Again, they're different in different places. They're just designed to undermine the freedoms that black people had gotten after the Civil War. These laws just grow and get more pernicious from 1880 to, the 1960s. And it's not until the Civil Rights Movement, which we'll cover in a few months, that a lot of these things get overturned. And guess what? You're going to have to send troops down there to enforce the laws. And it was the removal of the troops that let all hell break loose, and it's the return of the troops that solves the problem again. But it's 85 really bad years down there. And it's a paradox that these very policies designed to solidify power and to make life better for the white aristocracy, they don't work because nobody really wants to live down there under these oppressive conditions. And so big industry stays away. This sort of aristocratic, old school sensibility that doesn't want to spend money on other people, well, it leads to really bad schools. So you have an undereducated population. Factories don't want to move down there. Companies don't want to move down there. Immigrants don't want to move there because of the racial issues. And the South stagnates because of this. So it hurts everybody, the black people more than anyone, but the whole South suffers because of the injustice of their fundamental outlook on life. And it's, again, this attempt to sort of keep this sort of European feudalism in America, and it's just not going to work. Unfortunately, it takes almost a century longer to really put the nail in the coffin. Interesting to speculate, what would have happened had, Andrew Johnson not been president after Lincoln, or if Ulysses S. Grant wasn't president after Johnson. What if somebody better, who understood these issues better and had a more accurate sense of reality, what if that person could have been president? What might that have looked like, and who might that have been? If there's one man for the job that I could pick from that time, it would be Thaddeus Stevens, a congressman from Pennsylvania. The thing that I think qualifies Stevens most is at a time when people are looking around to take the temperature of the room and how do people feel about this, he doesn't really care about that, He's like, all men are created equal, and they're endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what the country's about. That's why we're here. And black people are getting denied that. And that's not okay. So we're going to do whatever's necessary to make sure that they are enfranchised like everybody else. What an extraordinary man he was. He had absolutely no interest in impressing other people. So almost all of his major charitable acts were done behind the scenes. If he saw somebody in need, he was a successful enough businessman in his own life. He had resources. He would find a way to get those people the resources they needed, whether it's money or education or whatever. He wrote the 14th Amendment. He worked hard for the 15th Amendment. He's chose to be buried in a pauper cemetery because he refused to be in a cemetery that only allowed white people and excluded other people. Just a direct interest in justice, and none of the puffery of honor of sort of Jeb Stuart and that crowd wanting to impress other people by their deeds. He's just devoted to justice, and he just pursues it with a dogged determination that seemed unlike anybody else at that time. And Stephen's view was very powerful, and in hindsight, he was just spot on accurate. He's like, we're not a confederacy, we're building a nation here. And a nation, to be a nation, needs that its constituents actually buy into its fundamental principles. So, half the country can't just ignore the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And so he said, in order to get fully readmitted, the southern states need to give blacks the vote. They need to give land to the black people, and they have to guarantee equality under the law. And if they're not willing to do that, then they don't get to be part of the country in good standing, and we need to keep troops down there as long as necessary until they do assent to that. Because he realized the freedmen needed land, they needed rights, and they needed somebody to enforce those. He just knew who he was dealing with. He knew he was dealing with unconverted white Southern aristocrats who wanted things to be like they were in 1850. And everybody else just sort of crossed their fingers. And Stevens just fought as hard as anybody could really fight to achieve what needed to be achieved to make things work. Unfortunately, he didn't carry the day. And again, we had a century of more problems because of it. So I tramp a perpetual journey, the main metaphor for the class. Let's take some time here and think that through. So we make some huge strides, and the issue is, who counts? In 1776, 1780s, it was landholding adult white male citizens who counted. And now it's all adult male citizens, regardless of their race. That's huge. That incorporates millions more people into who counts. So the journey of freedom goes forward, but remember, it's not so simple. So you've got it in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, but it's not in the law in 1776. In the 1860s, it gets into the law, but it's not in practice. People won't do it. They won't live by it. And so there's a big asterisk next to this triumph, because it's going to take another 100 years in the South before these issues become more or less real, even though there's still struggles today. So we got to keep in mind vision, legislation, action, head, heart, hands, understanding, feeling, and doing. They're all necessary. They all have to act in concert for gains to be made socially. So I want us to think about, who counts as we, and who do we include in our in-group, and think about the extraordinary suffering, just unbelievable suffering of so many Black Americans, Native Americans, immigrants that were caused by people loving to have a little group that they consider theirs and having a bigger group that doesn't get to be in their group, and treating them differently. And that's what this came down to. And to empathize with 10 people you're close to and not to empathize with the rest of the world. What a bizarre choice to make. And so here you are in 8th grade. It's a time that's notorious for in-group formation and exclusion. And so we're really trying to get you to think through, are you an in-grouper? Are you somebody who likes to draw boundaries and exclude other people? Or do you really want everybody to succeed? Remember, we call that benevolence, when you're just after the good for everybody, and empathy and compassion, and you actually own the success of all of your peers, of everybody in the 8th grade, and everybody in the middle school, and everybody at St. Mark's, and everybody in Dallas, and everybody on the earth. And some of those people might be behaving in ways where they're your enemies. But the hope would be that even when you're fighting them, you would hope, you hope that their lives would be good. You wish their lives were good, right? Even though you have to fight them because you disagree about whatever. And so really try to think through, why put people in an out group? Look at all of the harm that was done by racism in America, and is still done by racism in America, but particularly in the South, both in terms of the people who are on the receiving end, but also the people on the doling out end. Like, why not support those people and revel in their success? Why build these walls? So we really want you to ask yourselves, is your 8th grade class strengthened when you exclude people, when you mock people, when there's somebody who's sort of weak and you push them aside rather than helping them, right? Why would you do that? Why don't you empathize and be compassionate with that person and be benevolent and help that person grow and own that growth yourself? You're just going to cause division in your class, right? Which is going to have to be settled down the road. Why would you not want somebody's energy positive and growing in among your own peers and your people that you go to school with, right? Why don't you own the success of everybody in your class, everybody in middle school? Well, wouldn't everything go better for you? And aren't you going to learn terrible habits by building these out groups? Are you going to build out groups at work? Are you going to have out groups in your family? Will you favor one of your children over others? How is this all going to play out? Why do this? Isn't it just harmful? So give that some thought. And then finally, just see the terrible consequences when people don't exercise ethical leadership, when they work for their own good and their own prejudices instead of the community as a whole. Terrible things follow from that. And so we just witnessed it, where corrupt politicians, corrupt businessmen, people who want to abuse other people in order to try to wring gain out of them rather than owning their success and thrilling in everybody's thriving. So if you've got people who are working for everybody's thriving, those tend to be thriving, healthy communities. And when you have people acting on their own account, they tend to be divisive, and the people aren't happy and things don't go well. So it's a self-defeating act to hurt somebody else in today's world. We're too interconnected. That doesn't work anymore. And so I hope that the lessons of Reconstruction aren't lost on you.